It's Friday, which means it's time for another exciting episode of Ask Us Anything on the Goggler Podcast. Bahir and I have to apologize if we're sounding a little croaky. We're both down with colds, which is why we sound especially sexy today, I say.
I was going to go with annoying, but sure, let's go sexy.
Let's go sexy. It works. No one else is going to say it, so we might as well say it.
I don't think we should be saying it either, but sure, why not?
All right, our first question comes from @DocSky3, who asks, where do you think the Penguin is going and how much of an impact will it make on the Batman Part 2? I think it'll have a pretty direct impact on the Batman Part 2, given that it's all a part of Matt Reeves' epic Batman crime saga thing. I mean, episode 1 takes place a week after the events of The Batman. And I think based on interviews, that it's going to lead directly into the Batman Part 2. As to where I think the Penguin's going, I'm not sure, but I'm quite excited because at the moment we're in episode 3, and the Penguin feels like a pretty sympathetic character. Like, I like him a lot.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't be liking the Penguin because he turns out to be a pretty villainous shit.
But I think what's interesting about the TV show is that we're never sympathetic to him in a misunderstanding sort of way. It's never in a, you just don't like him because you see him be bad because actually he's a good guy. No. I don't know about a villain. He's definitely not a mob boss yet, but he is all in on the bad guy.
Yes.
He doesn't care if he's with the Maronis or with the Falcones. He just wants power. He just wants money. He just wants to be influential.
And I think it's because we dislike the other guys more than we dislike him.
And even then, even in a TV show, they're very clear in that the Penguin is not a good guy. He is very clearly a bad guy. He is just more charming, I guess.
I think that's it.
The way he works with his driver, I think he was referred to. Yeah, he is a bit harsh at times, but then the way he pulls it back to buy the guy's confidence and loyalty makes it really an interesting character. So I am very happy with how they're drawing the Penguin, in that they're not giving him a secret backstory that suddenly makes me love him.
But I'm actually excited to see how Colin Farrell plays that descent out, because I'm assuming by the time we get to episode 8, he's going to be somewhat irredeemable, because from watching this series, it's very clear that they're not trying to do the stupid, oh, it's a villain story that's not a villain story that Sony keeps trying to do with their Spider-Man spin-offs, right? This one, it's very clear that the Penguin is the bad guy. And while Colin Farrell may start off as a sympathetic character because he's the downtrodden among the mafioso, I'm assuming by the end of episode 8, he's going to be more than just like an underboss. He's going to be a don of some sort.
Brandon Ho Sheng Ven asks, in the event of HBO's The Franchise ever getting a second season, which film genre would you like to see the series satirize and why?
I have an answer to this.
Go for it.
It'll be the ultimate satire. It's not a film genre. I would like them to satirize the inner workings of a streaming service like Netflix.
Oh, yeah.
How they just want to churn out content irrespective of how shitty it is, because they just have to fill that catalog and keep subscribers happy.
I would double down and say do the HBO Max, HBO Go Max thing, whether we're TV, whether we're broadcast, whether we're called Max or not, whether or not we're going to be folded in with ABC Sports or not. Like, I'd love to see all that. I'd love that to be the joke, because I was thinking about this, and another film genre will be hard. I think the only other ridiculous one could be like a Game of Thrones-esque show. Although I don't think HBO would want to do that, only because it feels too close. They don't want to make fun of their one successful show right now.
Unless somehow, just like how they managed to con them into thinking this is about the MCU and not about them, these creators say, hey, actually it's about something else.
I actually think that if it gets a second season, they should just stay with the superhero genre, because there's enough there to mine, right? Like right now, they've set up this interconnected universe. We could always just jump to a different film within that interconnected universe. And sure, maybe the stories on the ground might be the same, but maybe you could find newer ridiculous stories. Maybe the whole should we fly to Budapest because they've got great tax break situation. I don't think it's necessary to sort of jump genres just yet.
A question from Matt, who asks, do you know why Netflix have been leaning into animation? I know there are breakthrough ones like Arcane, Terminator, and Blue Eyed Samurai, but there are just so much more coming. Is there evidence that they are reaping up numbers there? There's just a cynical part of me that thinks they want to do big IPs like Lara Croft or Jurassic Park without having to really pay for it like HBO or Amazon does. We genuinely don't have an answer to this because Netflix are incredibly gun shy about talking about things like this. We also don't know the data because they don't necessarily share that data. They'll tell you when something is doing incredibly well, like Arcane or Terminator or Blue Eyed Samurai, because they have the numbers, they're very proud of it. But that also goes to show that the vast majority of the animation they release don't have those numbers. From what I understand, a lot of the anime stuff that they put out, their Netflix originals, not the licensed stuff, actually doesn't do very well. And that has a lot to do with the politics of anime and manga and Japanese creators and how they don't see anything other than hand-drawn anime as being authentic, etc., etc. It's a whole other story. But I will say, I think you may have a point in that animation is an easy way to get into a recognizable brand like The Boss Baby or Jurassic Park or even Lara Croft Tomb Raider without the cost that comes with a live action film adaptation. And that might be it. That might be a way to cash in on the brand because that's all they're looking for, right? They're looking for name recognition because if you see Tomb Raider, The Legend of Lara Croft, you're likely to click play because you know something about it. Or Jurassic Park, oh, that's a famous thing. It must be good. And I think that's what they're counting on.
But I'm wondering if a lot of this is coming out of their Japan office. I may be cynical and I may be a dum dum, but a lot of content, animation content coming out of Netflix tends to have that look, that Asian anime look. So I'm wondering if they've got like an overall deal with some studios in Japan and they're just giving them stuff to do. Wasn't there a thing 2 years ago? They made a big deal about signing up a studio.
That was when they announced that they were heavily investing in anime production. And also because it feels like trends that they jump onto, in that Netflix felt anime has a following, we need to get on that, we need to jump in on that following, and then K-drama has a following, so we need to get in on that, and we need to produce our own K-dramas. And so everyone is trying to get their fingers in every pie. It's not just Netflix, it's View, it's Disney Plus. I think the only people who aren't really pursuing that line seem to be HBO and Apple TV Plus, but I think it is a kind of jumping on the trend bandwagon as well.
Even though Terminator is a very Western IP, the way they've drawn it up literally makes it very anime. That may attract a certain audience or following.
We've got a couple of questions about Joker. The first one is from @Travesty, who asks, well, the first installment of Joker was heavily inspired by Taxi Driver. Folie à Deux took cues from the King of Comedy. Just like the movies they were inspired by, the first was a tremendous success, followed by a failed sequel. Is this coincidence or just Hollywood refusing to learn? Well, actually, I think the first Joker took its cues from both King of Comedy and Taxi Driver, right? I think Todd Phillips' big coup was getting Robert De Niro to play that character at the end of the movie that Arthur Fleck shoots. And so I don't know if it is Hollywood refusing to learn its lesson from everything we've read about the failure of Folie à Deux. It feels more like a Todd Phillips problem.
Yeah, but I would also put some of that down onto the new studio heads, right? So there were two executives that were brought in to replace the previous one that had sort of marshaled the first Joker through. And I think they just sort of decided to let Todd Phillips have his way with the follow-up film.
And here's the thing. It's normal for these sorts of things to happen. But some of the details that we've read about it feel incredibly strange. For example, whenever a movie makes $1 billion at the box office, yes, the directors are hailed as heroes and they are given a little more creative control. It's very rare, even if you are a $1 billion director, even if you are a Steven Spielberg, that a studio gives you final cut. Final cut in Hollywood is something quite rare. In this situation, they seem to have handed Todd Phillips the keys to the kingdom. It is even rarer that you don't do any preview screenings or focus groups. Apparently, even Endgame, Infinity War, they all had focus groups, and the Russo brothers were $1 billion directors by then. And yet, for some reason, these new heads of Warner went, hey, Todd Phillips, you do your thing. The excuse they gave was, oh, we didn't want any spoilers to leak. There are no spoilers in this goddamn movie. After 15 minutes, you know exactly how it's going to play out.
I mean, for me, the one spoiler is what happens at the end.
You know how it's going to play out, Bahir. You've seen enough movies where you go, I know where this is going. It would be surprising if it didn't end that way.
Yeah, but you have to be in the hall to come to that realization, right? Like, I think that was the only major spoiler that you don't want released. And that's fine, I get it. But, dude, I think Endgame had bigger spoilers than that.
Huge, much bigger spoilers than that. And so I don't think it was Hollywood not learning its lesson. I think it was a desperate studio who thought they may have a moneymaker on their hands and went, listen, do your thing. We're desperate. We don't want to curtail your freedom. Just give us another winner, please. I think the relationship was so strained between Todd Phillips and the rest of the studio that James Gunn and Peter Safran had absolutely nothing to do with Joker. There's barely any commentary on either side. I think the only thing Phillips had said was, oh, Gunn and Safran were like, let Todd do his thing.
Essentially, the argument to that was that they had approved Joker 2 before those guys came on board for DC Studios. So they were like, oh, it's unnecessary for them to get involved. And
it's a Warner Brothers project, even though there is a DC logo at the end, and even though this is one of their most iconic characters.
I don't think that this is a failure of the system in general. I just think this is a failure of having producers on board to rein people in. I think this was purely I don't know about passion project, but I think it became a passion project. I think it became a vanity project for Todd Phillips.
I was going to say, I don't think passion project, but hey, I think vanity project.
Yeah, vanity is probably the better word. So this movie is what we got.
All right, which brings us to the second question about Joker. The hate from the Joker movie just feels a little bit exaggerated at this point, with some people calling it the worst comic book franchise, even worse than Madam Web. Do you think that some of the hate also comes from people who have an agenda against DC media in general? And do you think that it's really that bad? I mean, surely nothing is worse than Madam Web.
I would rather watch Madam Web again.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
Madam Web was a failure of composition in that whatever vision the director may have had, if you take out Dakota Johnson's shitty acting, but whatever vision the director may have had was chopped up by a studio that decided to refocus its comic book agenda.
Yeah.
Sony decided that they were going to get out of the multiverse business, the interconnected universe business, and make standalone films. And so they recut this movie, ADR'd the hell out of it to make it something different. I would love to see what Madam Web originally was, because even if you watch it in its current state, you can see where all the chops are. You don't even have to be an expert in film to see where those chops are. My problem with Folie à Deux is that it feels so antagonistic to the audience. It feels like Todd Phillips went, fuck you for misunderstanding my first movie, or fuck you for liking it too much. I'm going to take that character that you may have enjoyed and completely turn it around. And it feels, based on the interviews that we've seen, that none of the actors or even the director seemed to understand the direction the movie was going in. Like Lady Gaga was on Graham Norton and she was talking about how Arthur Fleck and Joker and who are these characters and what they want to be and how Harley or her version of Lee loves both Fleck and Joker. And I'm like, have you seen your movie? That's not what happens in the end of that movie. She wants one over the other. She loves Joker, not Arthur. And then if you're coming to it from the point of view of a comic book fan, it's even worse because this has nothing to do with the character. And then it feels even more shameless because the only reason you use that name was because you wanted an established brand and you wanted the audience that came with it. Because you knew that if you wrote a movie about a man called Arthur Fleck, who was this white incel who had been abused and goes on a murdering spree, nobody would give a shit. It only mattered because it was in Gotham. It only mattered because there was a Wayne attached to it. And it only mattered because this was one of the most iconic villains of all time. So like now when Todd Phillips comes out and goes, oh, he wasn't actually Joker to begin with. Fuck you, man.
It doesn't even feel like damage control at this point. It really just feels like everybody's just grasping at anything to make themselves sound cool and sound like the failure of this movie is not their fault. Which is ironic seeing as how all those people are the people who were involved and responsible for it, right? The director and the two lead actors. You can't try and sing the song about how artistically exciting they were because they kept rewriting scenes on the go and they would huddle every day and make everybody wait because they were just trying to work out a different way to do a scene or whatever. But the problem with that is you then have disjointed sequences. You have sequences that stand on their own as a 3-minute short, but isn't related to the 3 minutes prior or the 3 minutes next. And I think that is the problem with the Joker.
The biggest problem with Folie à Deux is that it's interminably dull. It is just a boring ass movie. It is aspiring towards some sort of intellectual artistry, but actually just fails.
Ed Eitfaus asks, I'm upset that the lesson that the industry has learned from the success of Barbie is to make more movies based on toys, while it should have been make more movies about women that are helmed by female directors. I know what you're saying, but at the same time, I also kind of respectfully disagree because there will always be movies about toys since the beginning of toys and movies. So I don't think Transformers 1 was really bolstered because of the Barbie thing. But at the same time, I also agree with you that there are not enough movies about women by women.
Exactly. And I think Barbie was an outlier because you had the powerhouse that was Margot Robbie. Like, she was the production powerhouse. She was a recognizable name. She had a production company which had already been nominated for a bunch of Oscars. She negotiated some phenomenal deals with Warner Brothers. She got Greta Gerwig in. Like, a lot of it had to do with the people behind the movie. And I think we cannot rely on Hollywood studios to push the agenda of telling more female stories or minority stories that are helmed by minorities and helmed by women because they really don't care. Like, honestly, the Hollywood system is driven purely by economics.
Yeah.
If the diversity stuff happens or some morally good thing comes from it, it's also because, they made some money along the way.
All those things you mentioned is true because if you look at the Barbie movie, it doesn't really hold Mattel in the best light. It doesn't really hold any of the rights owners of that brand in great light. The way Greta Gerwig did the executive boardroom sequences with Will Ferrell and his dumb execs. Mattel doesn't come off good with this. Mattel is name dropped, I think, a couple of times once Margot Robbie's Barbie gets into the real world, but it isn't a toy movie. It is a movie about this character that tries to learn something and change the world along the way, right?
Yeah.
This isn't a toy movie. It's like I have trouble putting Barbie in the same genre as a air quote toy movie because it really wasn't a toy movie. It was more than that. I think that is what made it successful.
At Iman Bahari coming at us this week with an incredibly difficult question. What do you guys think is the best era/decade for music across genres? I don't think there is an answer to this, but I will tell you that I think the 70s and early 80s were probably the best decade for rock.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think late Beatles, I mean, I love early Beatles, but late
Yeah.
Beatles, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Fleetwood Mac, they just put out the kind of music that everyone emulates until today.
Yeah. I agree.
This era in particular is terrible for rock. If you are a rock music fan, I echo the Gallaghers when they say the 1975 is not rock. It is just, it isn't even a pale imitation. It doesn't even fall in the same category.
But that's the problem, right? Like in this day and age, any guitar sound, let alone a guitar sound with a little bit of distortion in it, is considered rock. When
So
actually
dumb.
1975 is pop.
Yes.
It's pop. I'm sorry, it's pop. It's straight up pop. And I agree with you. I think the late 70s, early 80s, I think that was probably the defining moment because, like you said, it sort of has affected music till now. Everybody's practically playing with the same chord progression, chord structure. The stuff that Ringo did on drums in those late Beatles records is being played now. A lot of early Paul McCartney Wings stuff is very recognizable now, you know. Personally, I've recently gotten very much into a genre of music that I hadn't heard of until now, until about a year ago, called yacht rock.
I have no idea what yacht rock is.
Dude, fucking Toto is yacht rock. Africa, that's what
Oh.
yacht rock is.
Wait, is that a new term or was it always called yacht rock?
I think it's a new-ish. I think maybe in the last 3 or 4 years.
Oh.
So like, you know, Baby Come Back from Player,
Like I used to, I mean, I listened to all those songs.
Daryl Hall and Oates, bro. That's yacht rock. I've gotten really into yacht rock recently.
Nice,
So,
nice. I mean, there are some decades that are clearly established as being great. So, for example, I think if you're looking at big band jazz, you go back to the 1930s, it is iconic, it is definitional. So, people consider the 1930s to be the best era of big band jazz, probably because it was invented and kind of came to life in that era.
yeah, that was the only kind of music being played at the time.
1950s, if you like bebop, all that stuff. So, I think with like the jazz age and stuff, it's a lot clearer. I think it's
Yeah.
very difficult to define a best era or decade for something like pop because pop changes with every decade. It's the very definition of pop.
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time, Beatles skirted that line because a lot of reviewers would call it pop music. Now we categorize it as rock and roll or rock.
Yeah.
But I think it's very difficult to define what a great era for pop is. And I think that boils down to the era that you grew up in as well as your own musical taste.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think classical music, jazz music, it's easier to define.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to go make a yacht rock playlist. Lah.
I'll share you mine, my
Oh,
friend. I'll
nice.
share you mine.
Okay.
Dude, I've
Set.
got a playlist, my friend.
Nice. All right.
And our last question, at Emius asks, recently there's been a trend of podcasts where former cast members or creators of a show start doing a watch-along discussion, like The West Wing Weekly, Chernobyl, The Last of Us, and recently Sidebar. Do you guys like this sort of stuff? And if you do, what do you listen to?
West Wing Weekly, for sure.
I don't listen to that anymore.
Oh, you don't? Oh, no, it's done. I mean, but I listened to it when it was going on.
I was as well, but then I think there was a point where they started doing non-West Wing episodes a lot.
Yeah.
I dropped off and I never came back to it, I think.
The filler episodes I would always skip, but
Yeah.
actually, Amy, to answer the first part of your question, yes, I actually like this sort of thing because I think it gives a different insight into what happens on the show. And I say that because as a journalist who's done interviews and junkets, it's a very different experience. You are getting the actor who is there to promote a show or a movie. There is a script of sorts. You're only going to get so much out of them. At the same time, as someone who doesn't partake in the process of acting or filmmaking, my questions tend to lean into the curious, right? Because I'm trying to figure out why they're doing what they're doing or what they loved about it and what made it so great, etc., etc. But I think there is an understanding that the actors have among themselves that only they can talk about. And so I think that insight is really, really cool when we listen to stuff like The West Wing Weekly or Fake Doctors, Real Friends with Donald Faison and Zach Braff.
Yeah.
That is also a very cool podcast. I enjoyed the Office Ladies podcast, which is about The Office, and they would get all the cast members to come in and dissect episodes and do the watch alongs. And yeah, it gives you a real insight, and also it gives you a sense of honesty, because I think enough time has passed that they can really talk about some of the stuff that happened. And I think it's not something you will get in an interview that's happening as the show is happening as well.
Sure. Yeah. Because they get a chance to look back, right?
I'll tell you what I'm listening to now that I really like. I don't know if you ever saw this series. Did you ever watch This Is Us?
No.
Okay, so I watched a lot of This Is Us when it was happening. There is a new podcast with Mandy Moore, Sterling K. Brown, and Chris Sullivan, who are all on the show. It's called That Was Us.
Right.
And the cool thing about this podcast is, one, they're doing the watch-alongs, and the three of them are absolutely fantastic. Like, they are really, I mean, Sterling K. Brown, he's very, very smart, very erudite. Mandy Moore, very eloquent. Chris Sullivan's very funny. But because This Is Us covered all of these crazy topics, right? Like adoption law, what it means to be black law, politics in America. It just covered everything lah. Each of these episodes gets into the weeds about all of those subjects as well, and how it kind of relates to the world today or America today and all of that stuff. So it's more than just how we made the show. It's also about these topics, about parenthood, about bringing up kids, about all of that stuff. And so it becomes something more than just, hey, on this episode, do you remember that scene? That was really funny, right?
The Apple TV Plus show For All Mankind, I don't think they did it for every season. I think they only did it late. But what they would do is they would do these bonus content pieces where they would talk about the science of what the show said was happening, right? So they would break down a little bit about the science of the kind of new tech rockets that they were proposing, that their characters were using, etc. So that stuff is cool. I like that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't really call it like a podcast. It was more like bonus content with the show. I think Apple TV also does a lot of podcasts for their shows. So it's almost like a watch the episode, listen to the podcast immediately after kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that's less of a look back and more of just like a look into their process, why they did it this way, maybe talk about the different things they've tried, etc. Yeah.
Oh, and lastly, if you're a Trek fan, there's a lot of it. Like, there's a lot of official Trek podcasts. So after every episode, they usually have one of these things. Some of them are hosted by Will Wheaton. He's really, really cool, and he's really, really nerdy and fun. And they always have the cast on to talk about the episode that just happened. So they do it for Strange New Worlds. They do it for Disco. They do it for all of their shows. And
Right.
So if you're a Trek fan, that's really cool, because yes, yet again, sometimes they speak to the tech people, they speak to the production side, the costume side. So you get a real insight into how every episode was made. So it's not really a watch along, but it's like a post episode discussion breakdown thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And God knows there are hundreds of Trek podcasts with podcasters like us dissecting everything, but the official ones are pretty cool too, because you really get some insider knowledge. So yeah, that's fun.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that was our last question. Thank you very much, EBS. That brings us to the end of another exciting episode of Ask Us Anything. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Keep them coming in. Our social media feeds are Goggler MY. You can also email us questions on podcast@goggler.my or send it to us on the Goggler hotline 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.